Hello and welcome to TMI with Aldous Tyler for Friday, November 13th. Friday the 13th, that is 2020. Um, this is the second attempt at a video segment, so let's see what we can do here. But the good news is, as like with the last one, I do have an interview to do with it. I think that'll keep things chugging along. Now, as you are probably aware, we had something called an election about 10 days ago. And during that time period, we decisively knew right away who was going to be the president. Well, no, that's not true. However, the good news is that eventually things sussed out so that the one of the two candidates who was the, let's just say, least desirable of the two main candidates was definitely shown that there was no path for them to get the necessary 270 electoral college votes. And thus, we have Joe Biden, the Democratic president-elect now of the United States of America, the 46th president, as soon as January 20th rolls around. And to many people, this was a cause for celebration. Can't blame them. I myself felt elated every time I saw one of those little states turn blue on the map. But the thing is that deep in my heart, I knew that this meant that the struggle was just beginning. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I, like my guest here, Steve Horn, am an environmentalist, and Steve himself has been reporting on the environment now for years. Steve, welcome back to TMI.
Good to be here, and I wore my Wisconsin coat just for you today. For
Oh,
the good memories of being in the studio.
go Badgers. You know, I
Yeah.
believe they're supposedly playing football this weekend, so here's to hoping. Here's to hoping they can all stay well. In any case, though, Steve, you have been, of course, keeping up with this all throughout the election season, ever since it was clear that Joe Biden was going to be the nominee from the Democratic Party. You made sure that it was very clear what was going on. Starting July 18th, there was an article that you had at therealnews.com called Climate Crisis. Biden Climate Plan will double down on oil, and Dakota Access lives on. And then fast forward a little bit into September, and at Drilled News, you had an article called How Fossil Fuel Friendly Policy Made Its Way into the Biden campaign's climate plans. And most recently in October, we see back at therealnews.com, House Dems pass climate bill boosting oil drilling lobbied for by Biden donor. So I appreciate the fact that you've been all over this. You've been making sure that we have the info that we needed to have a realistic outlook so that once we managed to get rid of Donald Trump, we knew exactly where we had to go since. I appreciate that, and I just wanted to start by saying that. But Steve, let me just start off by asking you, what do you think is the biggest target we should have when it comes to trying to stop Joe Biden from pushing policies that really are not very climate friendly?
Well, I think that the name of the game is going to. You and I have talked for so many years now about fracking, which is the horizontal drilling technique through which you penetrate shallow rock basins underneath the earth, generally going about a mile under the earth and a mile deep. You know, variations in between that, but deep into the Earth's crust in order to obtain this oil and gas. And that's been the battle over the past decade for those who are following oil and gas policy in the United States. And that will still be something that's important. But as we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, the fracking industry has greatly struggled to stay afloat really financially because it's so expensive to do this kind of, to use this technology to extract oil and gas in this way. And it relies on a very, significantly high global price of oil. And that price of oil has gone down due to the global recession, if you will, with COVID-19. And so that will still be something that's important, but in its place, and what these articles that you just pointed to highlight is a new frontier, if you will, of oil and gas drilling. It's something, in particular oil, that's something that's existed for decades, but has never had the correct financial incentives and especially the right narrative, I think, to really be scaled up, the public narrative, the public policy narrative, if you will, to be scaled up in the right way. And what the articles outline is a renewed push, just like fracking, 10, 15 years ago, to position something called, what the articles outline, what's been called enhanced oil recovery, which is a method through which carbon is captured at power plants or other industrial uses. It is then sent in carbon dioxide pipelines into oil fields and then pumped under the ground. That's where it is what they call sequestered. So it's carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. So the sequestration is kind of tied to the U, and the utilization is the carbon is used to pump more oil out of the ground. Basically, when you tap into a well, not all of the oil comes out. There's something called residual oil, and with carbon dioxide as a commodity, you can actually pump that carbon dioxide under the ground and get more oil. So that is kind of, long story short, this is a huge part of not only we'll say Biden's climate plan and the vast bulk of establishment Democratic Party's climate plan, but it's actually something that I think not a lot of people really realize. It's a shared bipartisan consensus. So I think that what to keep your eyes on is we have a Senate that is most likely going to be either very divided or maybe slightly in favor of the Republicans. You have to remember in the Senate, though, that even at least one of the Democrats is super oil and gas friendly, Joe Manchin, who's a Democrat from West Virginia. So
Oh yeah.
it's going to be hard to get through progressive kind of stuff through at least the Senate. If not, obviously there's going to be hurdles in the House as well. But one of the things that's shared is this vision of what I just described, CCUS, or enhanced oil recovery, or as it's known, it's enhanced CO2 EOR, carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery. That's what the whole process is called. That's the new frontier in oil drilling. That is something that to be watched out for, because as I mentioned, it's not just that Biden supports it. It's not just that as you pointed to the article, that the weeks before the election, the House passed their climate bill, which probably won't pass in the Senate, but can be seen as like a symbolic look at what might happen in 2021. Basically, you can see that there's a lot of momentum behind this. It's in all of Biden's climate plans. It's even alluded to in his transition team website. There's potentially a lot of money being lined up because it's a way, capital from companies and research and development money, because it's basically seen as a way to keep drilling for fossil fuels, but also call it a climate solution at the same time. So that's really the thing to keep our eyes on in the first 100 days of the Biden administration. To be honest with you, something to keep our eyes on even during this lame duck phase of Donald Trump, and see what kind of stuff happens like in budget deals and stuff, because Congress is still in session until the end of the year, doing having to pass budgets and end of the year stuff.
Well, right, and of course having to keep an eye on what shenanigans might come down from the current White House and such. They've got their plates full. However, but basically with this carbon capture technology, it's using that potential environmental positive then to greenwash, if you will, the practice of pulling even more carbon-based fuel out of the ground is what it's doing.
Yeah, and in the name of, at the very end of it, there's this chance that you can sequester, millions or billions of tons of carbon under the ground in these injection wells. Is sort of so I guess they kind of don't talk as much about the part that it's being used to extract the oil. They talk more about the sequestering it under the ground, but for the most part, it's being sequestered in these oil fields, because that's where the infrastructure already is, where else are wells set up where you're going into the ground. It's oil fields. So yeah, that's why it's CCUS. And as I keep saying, the U in CCUS is for utilization or use. The use is to extract more oil. So that's exactly correct. And, I'll just give an example. In the week, a lot of this stuff gets lost in the hoopla of the election cycle, but weeks before and I'll give kind of two big things happen in the weeks before the election. And they both have to do with Wyoming, of all places. So
Oh yeah.
Wyoming, yeah. So Wyoming made it easier in the weeks before the election to they have complete oversight now. So the EPA does not have oversight. This is something that Trump pushed. So Wyoming now, they have complete. It's called primacy. They have the right to grant permits for these injection wells for the carbon dioxide, as I mentioned,
Without any federal oversight at all.
exactly, or at least like it's at least secondary now. So the first tier of it is Wyoming. Wyoming, of course, is a very oil, gas, coal friendly state. And at the same time, Wyoming, this was even closer to the election. I think it was the environmental impact statement was published on October 23rd, I want to say. So just a couple weeks before the election, Wyoming is really a crucible for all this stuff. So they have something called the Wyoming Pipeline Corridor, and that has to do with these CO2 pipelines. So not only is it easier now in Wyoming under this EPA rule to inject this stuff under the ground, the carbon dioxide, but it's also there's this thing in motion. This has at least the EIS is out, so it's got momentum. And as I said, it's kind of bipartisan. I'm not really sure where Biden stands in this, in particular on this Wyoming program, but this is a vision to implement over 2,000 miles of CO2 pipelines, which would be linked into Wyoming's oil fields and linked into Wyoming's coal-fired power plants, linked into their gas-fired power plants, et cetera. So really I see it as like the first frontier of all this is happening right here, right now in Wyoming. And of course, we're talking about Biden, but everything, we're talking about the future with Biden, but everything I'm talking about right now happened under Trump. So Trump is really laying the groundwork for a thing that at least seemingly Biden very much also supports. And so do, I would say that the vast bulk of establishment Democrats. There is, of course, I'll mention the progressive Democrats, like the AOC bloc, you could call it the squad, is
Right.
opposed to this.
Well, and Steve, one thing which I want to make clear, one of the reasons why we're examining what's happened under Trump and what's coming up in the works or what as currently has political momentum behind it is because, let's face it, one of the things that Joe Biden is known for during his time as vice president and also as a senator before then is doing his best to make deals across the political divide so that that he would give them something that they would want and then hopefully get something he wants out of it. But by basically outlining what's currently in the pipeline and also what's already been put into place under, say, the Trump administration, we're able to see the kinds of things that he might be trying to or be willing to try to give away, so to speak, to appease Republicans in order to get whatever it is he's looking for. And it may not be the most environmentally friendly things that he's looking to give away.
Yeah, and there's already an article that came out. I believe it would have been Monday this week in Inside Climate News that really outlined that this particular thing we're talking about is seen as one key way that Biden could be reaching out to Republicans and making happen. And what that would logically mean is it would be a continuance of the Trump agenda. And just to be clear, if we want to walk it back a little bit, this is also something that was supported in large part by the Obama administration as well. So this, in general, this is something that has a lot of bipartisan consensus around it. And I would say for viewers, whenever you hear this is bipartisan, it generally doesn't mean that it's good. It doesn't, at least by default, it doesn't mean that it's a great thing for humanity. Often it could mean a horrifying thing for humanity. Just think about U.S. foreign policy and the bipartisan consensus on a lot of things around that and what it means for people around the world. But yeah, that is, you laid it out exactly correct. And we are seeing the seeds of even some of the people who were behind what happened under Obama maybe coming back to be in the Biden administration. For example, the Secretary of Energy during Obama's second term, Ernest Moniz, is under strong consideration. He was also the top climate aide for Biden to be Secretary of Energy again. He's someone who, very supportive of what we're talking about right now and actually has conflicts of interest around that because he's on the board of directors of a power plant company named Southern Company that is hooked into this exact industry where they want to do carbon capture at their plants in the southern part of the United States. We have under consideration for the EPA, Mary Nichols here in my home state now of California. She heads the Air Resources Board. She's also shown strong support for carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon capture utilization and sequestration here in California. There's one key power plant in Kern County, the biggest drilling county in the state, called the Elk Hills power plant. It's a natural gas power plant where some of this is being pushed. It's also known as Cal Capture. So we're seeing potentially personnel in a future Biden administration being floated that is also supportive of this. So it's kind of a long story short way of saying there's bipartisan momentum around this and a lot of people in Biden's inner circle who support this kind of thing.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are talking to Steve Horn, who can be found often on therealnews.com, also on drillednews.com, plenty of other places. And Steve, one of the things I want to make sure that people understand is that While again, it looks like at least the Senate's going to be a difficult place for things to happen for the next 2 years or so, we are not completely without allies in Congress in general. As you mentioned, you have AOC in the squad. Would there be anybody else we should be focusing on trying to support in order to try to accomplish at least some better things for the environment at this time?
Yeah, well, there's a bill, and I forgot the name of it off the top of my head, but it was also floated. There's all these bills that kind of come up that are messaging bills that really have no chance of passage, but they show symbols of what might come forward depending on the formulation of Congress. And one of those, basically, it called for no subsidies to fossil fuel industries. That had like the squad behind it, and they outlined one of the things in it is called 45Q, which is the main tax subsidy that creates the exact infrastructure that we're talking about. It was something that was created about a decade ago, and it was re-upped in a congressional bill in 2018, which was passed in a bipartisan budget bill. So one of the things within that bill was to get rid of this 45Q tax subsidy. So I mean, one of the ways that I think that the climate justice movement has gone about thinking about tackling this is just go after the subsidies, because this is an industry that is, like fracking, as we mentioned before, in great need of subsidies. Fracking, if you think about the origins of it decades ago, and there's a study that the Breakthrough Institute did on this that Obama actually cited in one of his State of the Union addresses. But the origins of fracking kind of all center around federal support for creating, just doing the R&D and doing the pilot projects and all of that. And that's really the stage that this carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration is at. It's a little further along than that, but it's greatly reliant on the subsidies. So I think that that'll probably be one of the big fights, is over continually subsidizing this. It already has this program called 45Q, as I mentioned, which is through the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS. So yeah, there's that. And then there's, I think just the broader discussion, I think, that will take place about within the first 100 days, which is we are also in an economic crisis in this country because of COVID-19 and the prolonged economic shutdowns, and just people not being out even close to as much as they used to be, and not doing what they were doing at the beginning of this year. So there's going to be a discussion around a stimulus and a green stimulus. And I think that most likely those in the climate justice movement are going to say, okay, well, this green stimulus should not be used towards CCUS. It should not be used to further entrench the fossil fuel industry. So I expect that to be basically a fight from day one, when, after Biden is inaugurated, God willing, if Trump actually leaves the White House and we get to that stage, which is a whole nother can of worms.
I did have a quote from someone who helps run just the White House in general earlier this week that I appreciated, which was that when they were asked about what if Trump refuses to leave, and they said, "Don't worry, we at the White House have plenty of experience escorting out trespassers." So, but in any case, that being neither here nor there, again, we're talking with Steve Horn. And therealnews.com is one of the more frequent places you find him. You can sometimes find him at drillednews.com. He has been, as always, on top of what's going on when it comes to the environment and politics. And one of the things that I wanted to also make sure to bring up with you then, Steve, is that so when we are looking at the case that with a Biden presidency, one of his big priorities, to the point where it's his first policy speech he gave after his victory speech, is the coronavirus, is the pandemic. It's likely then, I would think, that he's going to be pressing for, if not an actual national shutdown, at the very least, he's going to be pushing for people to stay home. The leadership of this nation is going to be talking about, we need to actually stop this wave that keeps coming back. We're going to have to stay home for more, which means that, of course, there's going to be a lot more clamoring from the fossil fuel industry, and also then from fracking, commensurately, to have even more subsidies because of the fact that people are going to be staying home more from this leadership. So we got to keep our eye on this 45Q based subsidies, and also the other ones that would be naturally, according to Washington, spread around to these industries.
And absolutely, and I want to add on top of that, yeah, it's not just the subsidies, but I think that even in the bluest state of California, and not all of these things were granted, but some of them were. There's a big wish list that the Western States Petroleum Association put out, which is the the voice of the oil industry. It's supposed to be in the Western states broadly, but it's mostly in California because it's the main state that still has oil drilling on the West Coast, so, and refineries and all of that. So after the initial shutdown of COVID-19 back in March and April, the oil industry in California basically put out a big wish list of, it's not so much the subsidies, but it's, we want an easing of regulations, these things that we would normally have to abide by, but because we are cutting costs and all of this, and so it'd be harder to comply with. So I think that that is clearly something that happened during the Trump administration in many different ways, and the Trump administration was, even without COVID-19, more than happy to deregulate the industry and slash any environmental protections that were put into place by the Obama administration and previous administrations. And so I would expect that, they would probably try to ask if there were those kind of more shutdowns, as you mentioned, if there's any kind of, if there's anything that Biden can actually do from the federal level that would be more harsh to stop this pandemic, as you mentioned, I would expect that the oil industry would at least ask for those kind of things. Whether or not it would be granted or all of it would be granted would remain to be seen. But I will say, in the case of California, there were definitely at least some things that were, it wasn't like the most egregious ones, but there was some easing off of some things, especially around probably you could say maybe even most importantly, just like not as much of a need for the industry to report back as consistently on monitoring, self monitoring, that kind of thing. So yeah, I could definitely see that being an ask if anything were put into motion, say come in January and February, if things still look really bad for COVID-19, which all signs point to they probably will look pretty bad in January and February.
Sadly, yes. Unfortunately, the leadership of Joe Biden on the coronavirus pandemic would be one of the places that I actually would be giving him quite a bit of credit to, and actually expecting him to lead fairly well with. I don't think that one in particular is something that I'm going to criticize him too much about. I don't think, at least we'll find out.
Yeah, I think, yeah, just to pry into that a tiny bit. The one thing that this is tangent a little bit, just into specifically on COVID-19, but I think that the hardest thing that I think he'll find is not so much that he's going to do something so bad or wrong, but it's going to be, it's one thing to kind of say I'm going to be a leader and I'm going to believe in science and do all that, but as you and I know, there's, because of especially the way that Trump handled the pandemic and led just millions of people to not even believe, millions upon millions to believe that it's not a big threat and that it's a hoax and not something to be taken very seriously and all of that. I think Biden's going to have a hard time convincing at least half of our population that it's just, it's not like he can all of a sudden come in and turn on a switch and all those people believe in it. And it takes way less than that to screw everything up for the whole country. But imagine if there's still going to be half the people who just aren't doing much. And I also think the other hurdle he'll run into is the fact that the federal government only has so much power to say and do certain things based on our federal system. So I still think that there's going to be states that are resisting what he says, and it's just I have a hard time seeing that he'll just have a kind of a clean route forward, and even with the best of intentions and the best plan of actually achieving it because of those kind of barriers.
Oh, I can believe that, but he will. First of all, he'll be putting out the opposite message that Trump did, and he'll have the assistance, of course, when it comes to convincing people that there's something they need to do. And when it comes to fighting the coronavirus, he'll have the added insistence of intubated ventilators all across the country. So, in any case, the point being, though, is that I want to just make sure to recap what we need to watch for right now, because the situation we have is that likely our activity levels are going to be ones that are not financially friendly to the fossil fuel industry. What we need to be watchful for then is specifically that as the coronavirus continues to be addressed as an issue, we're going to need to watch out for increase in subsidies, increase in emergency funding just being granted to carbon-rich fuel sources, the big oil and all that kind of thing. And we're going to have to keep an eye on those politicians out there that seem to be pushing hard on it versus those that are trying to find better choices for us to take.
Yeah, and to put the kind of the finest point on, I think the barrier that exists and the way that this 45Q and the way that the CCUS will be positioned is that even I'm going to just do a name check. So Sheldon Whitehouse, who's kind of known as one of the most climate-friendly senators in the United States Senate, he is he calls out the climate denial machine. He calls out the influence of dark money of the fossil fuel industry on Congress and all of that. But at the same time, he's a true believer in this 45Q and the need to scale up CCUS. And it's something that even the UN, in one of its scenarios in its 2018 report, the United Nations says that to tackle climate change, CCUS may need to be considered. So there's just a lot of momentum around this in the climate establishment. So it's going to be definitely that's where you'll see, I think, one of the sharpest battle lines happening is around the CCUS between the climate justice progressive wing of the climate movement and the more establishment wing, which does have a lot of momentum. And I think that in the climate justice wing, there's still a learning curve to be had. There's not as much knowledge about what we're talking about as, say, fracking, but yeah, I definitely think that this will be one of the big things that comes up come January 20th, 21st, 22nd, when Biden is talking about his recovery plan, is will this kind of thing be included within it? Will there be R&D money going towards it, subsidies, et cetera? So yeah, I mean that, and of course still fracking and all this other stuff we've talked about, but this is definitely one that's got renewed energy in the past year or so since Biden has really took the leading position and then became the nominee.
Renewed energy toward non-renewables. What do you know? So again, we've been talking to Steve Horn here. Again, you can find him often at realnews.com. Again, occasionally at drillednews.com. Steve, is there anywhere else you would like people to see about seeking you out at?
Absolutely. I would say look out in the coming weeks for my coverage, mostly on California oil, but with stuff with national implications as well at capitalandmain.com, which
Capitalandmain.com. Gotcha.
correct. Yep.
All right. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, some new terms for you to learn, and look up CCUS. Was 45Q?
Yep.
CCUS 45Q. Add that to the list with fracking of things you want to talk to your representatives and your senators about not supporting. That is, of course, if you want to see a future with a much lower carbon footprint. Steve, thank you for joining us on TMI here.
My pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
You're welcome. You've been listening to TMI with Aldous Tyler. We'll be right back.